Hello again, everyone. Please join me in welcoming back to the stage the writer and the director of Silent Friend, Ildikó Enyedi. And also joining us is Benjamin Blackman, many roles at Berkeley, but our botanist. Associate Professor at the Department of Plants and Microbiology and Integrative Biology, which is important because we're talking about integrative biology. Thank you both so much for being here. All right, I think I want to start from a place of kind of approaching this as a story, and this, at Ildikó, you're no stranger to challenging and very large-scale stories. Although it seems to me, I said this to you at dinner, that you're more interested in what the specificity of the moment than perhaps the way that the actual narrative arc of the story. You get there, but you're very interested in what's happening in front of the camera. This is such an expansive story. We're in 1908, in the 1970s, in 2022, and you wrote this challenge for yourself. And I'm just curious, can you tell us a little bit about the materials that you used to prepare yourself as you were both writing the script and bringing on the crew?
Well, the film somehow summarizes some of my very long time hobbies, just to read about and watch lectures about neuroscience, first of all, the aspects of what is consciousness, nobody knows, and about plant communication. I'm a very old person. I was a teenager in the 70s, and that was the first wave of you have seen in the film. And this very touchingly naive, but nevertheless very important experiments. Somehow the mere fact that the interest turns towards plants, who they are, what the hell they are doing around us, I think that was fundamental. And if we deduce the New Agey, a bit too optimistic part of the era, I think it was very much important, this shift of view, and somehow it was very coherent with the rest of the era. In every field of life, to reinvent ourselves, to try to find new frames for our everyday life, for our communication, also with humans and also with the modern human. So somehow, when I started to prepare for the film, many layers of this past activated, and of course I jumped on actual research, but more or less I try to follow at least that what is approachable, understandable for an amateur like me.
And you consulted with a number of scientists. They're mentioned at the end, neuroscientists and botanists and whatnot. I'm curious, what was the most interesting piece of feedback you got from some of those consultants as you were preparing the script or perhaps prepping for production?
Actually, I met a young researcher in Torino. There is probably you know that there is a really important research lab there with a very old botanical garden, and it was just really beautiful to see these young men. I think 9 or 10 researchers work there. It was a very monk-like but a very cheerful monk, like way of life, leaving the city, walking in every morning in this botanical garden, and just don't giving a fuck about politics and anything else, and knowing that what they are doing is actually much more important. So it was beautiful. We kept contact with this young scientist, and somehow it is jumping to nearly today. I had the same feeling when we presented the film recently in Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, China. And in the south of China, I visited another botanical garden, which was closed from the public. Okay. So just research. There were about 15 researchers and PhD students working there in the garden. One part was one research project was about a cancer treatment with plants and so on. And there was a quarantine for the plants arriving from abroad. That was also funny to see. They are sitting there and waiting to be released. And there I found the same thing. They cooked themselves their lunch. They invited us. And this sort of very genuine attention, this sort of tender but very resilient attention to something is so touching. So I envy you enormously for your way of life.
We're gonna come. I want to come back to that about perspective and about how perhaps our engagement with nature can shift how we interact with the world, because we were talking about that earlier. But Ben, as somebody who studies the perhaps interiority of plants and how that they are communicating, could you tell us a little bit about, because you shared this earlier and it was wonderful, when you were watching the film, kind of perhaps what your first impressions were, and were you surprised and delighted that a plant could shut a gate, or a ginkgo tree could be impregnated by perhaps not quite fossilized, but not quite paleo, but some ancient sperm? Like, what were your first reactions?
I mean, overall, it's a beautiful film, and the way that it is shot and showcases plants both as being observed and observing, I think, helps really kind of center where we stand with respect to them and where they stand with respect to us. I think particularly I found the early pandemic scenes pretty affecting as a contrast to what had come before, because in the early parts of the film, the campus is buzzing, there's so much activity, and the buildings are alive just as the garden is alive. But then once the pandemic hits, then the campus is empty, and it's just Professor Wang and the porter. But the garden is still full of life, and there's creatures scurrying around, there's growth above and below ground. And so, it kind of creates the contrast between how plants in sensing and responding to the environment and growing toward the light or toward water or in communication with each other, that they're engineering their own environments and building them and creating them for others, whereas we inhabit our own environments as well. And when we're not in them, then it becomes very isolating. Yeah.
It is really beautiful, and I do want to go back and talk a little bit about the reflective moment of Dr. Wang looking at the window. But first, can plants close a gate?
Yes, that's a great question. Plants do use electrical signaling for very rapid responses. If you think about like a Venus flytrap, for instance, or the mimosa that was shown in the film, like those very rapid responses are due to electrical signals, due to calcium ions or other things in the plant's vasculature in their circulatory system. Whether one could engineer, and certainly clearly you can get readouts of that, as was happening in 2 of the time periods. But whether one could engineer to specifically discern a signal of, I'm somehow in a plant's view from however many meters away. I don't know how to engineer that exactly. I could imagine that in the scene where there's the other sit-in participants smoking, that would create some sort of stimulus that would excite something in the plant that could then, if it was hooked up to a gate, then send a signal that was going to happen. But how one could engineer a specific signal, I don't know. Yeah.
Ildikó, I don't know if you know this. It's very popular here in the U.S. when you're under the age of 10 to do a science project, usually on plants, where we see if they respond to music or to being spoken to or being in the dark, and it's something that a lot of us do. To varying degrees of success, depending on what kind of a student you are. But I'm just curious, like, did you have that kind of exposure at some point in your education system? What had you read or seen that made you inspired to have this very engaged plant that was actually a character that was learning how to respond to its caretaker and to shutting a gate?
Actually, it is an old memory from the 70s, end of 70s, a Canadian scientist who had his lab and made these experiments, I think, with tomatoes. If tomatoes are communicating not with each other, it wasn't yet the time, just if they react, and had a potted plant at home, and for fun put some sensors also on this potted plant. What you see, this equipment in the film is really from the 70s. We worked with a crazy guy, an electro engineer who is creating sensors even today for plants, and is working in agriculture, for example, and so different territories. But he remained a sort of big child of the 70s, so he's a bit sometimes overly enthusiastic. Anyway, jumping back to the Canadian scientist, he recognized a pattern that when he arrives with his car, afterwards he could see a change in the graph, is it called? And so he amplified this tiny electrical signal, and probably the half of the story was true. Probably he really had the sensors, and he really perceived something, and he really amplified it and connected it to the garage door. Actually, the article said that the plant opened the garage door for him when he arrived. Of course, not wanting to open anything, but just to react. So it fitted this sort of the era, the 70s, and also this young man who is discovering barely out of teenage times this little potted plant. You must know that in Europe, geranium is the equivalent of boring.
It's like a carnation here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about interactive biology, and as a lead into that, I'd like to ask you first, Ildikó, about the ginkgo tree. And I think you said you used 4 different trees to represent our silent friend here in the film. But did you know that we talked earlier about how one of the saddest lines for me in the film was when Leah Seydoux' character says something about when she sees a garden, she just sees a bunch of like lonely strangers, essentially. For you, when you were writing this, did you think of the tree as someone that was perhaps isolated and lonely and waiting to be understood, or did you think of the tree as somebody who was very much so as an organism that was very much so integrated and speaking with its environment?
I think we shouldn't be ashamed of our human vocabulary because we don't have anything else. And if we can, for example, every day we say sunset, but the sun is actually not going down. But whatever. So this film is really doesn't want to show how plants are observing us, just want to draw attention to the fact that they are observing us. So I forgot your question.
I was curious if you thought of the tree as a solitary figure as somebody that was connected.
I actually, I thought so because this is, and there you please correct me. This is a species very much following another logic than the rest of the plants around it. It was extinct nearly totally about 6 million years ago. To speak about it in San Francisco, it's really special. Here are the redwoods, and just in some decades, about 100 years or 150 years ago, we humans, with our cheerful dumbness, nearly made them totally extinct. It was shocking to hear that it's just 4% of the really small rest remained. So because there is no other ginkgo in the garden, and because there is no plant, how to say, even different plants can create a community. So the others have a social life. This tree doesn't have, but you tell me that how dumb it is.
I mean, it depends on how you look at what are valuable resources, right? Like in terms of this tree, it's not competing necessarily with any others in the population for whatever it is specifically adapted to withdraw from the environment, and it's growing and clearly thriving. The thing that it's missing is the reproductive opportunity. So that's, to the extent that this plant is producing, because it's female producing its ovules and waiting for pollen that's not arriving potentially, but at the same time, gymnosperms like ginkgo are wind pollinated, and so they the males cast out just like so much pollen, just like clouds and clouds and clouds of pollen. And so, it really just depend on how close or how far away.
But do you think the tree was lonely?
I mean, it had its owl friend, right?
Well, we were talking about integrative species, and earlier we were talking about whether or not, like, Leah says that she sees a bunch of lonely or isolated or, just a bunch of strangers. And we were talking about whether or not, is it possible that that the tree, is it possible that it was perhaps in communion with the rest of the garden, or was it actually lonely?
I mean, I think there's in any community, there's, you are, whether human or plant, but specifically human for sure, if you are the only one of your type there, that's an isolating experience, and that's certainly what our main characters in the film were feeling. But there's, also when it's accepted and welcomed, unlike in the first part, but maybe more in the second part, then, being part of that greater community and finding others who are unlike you is also a great thing. So.
We were talking, though, about whether or not it would be possible for the ginkgo tree to be perhaps in dialogue with other plants in the garden. Like, could it be communicating about lack of nutrients or sunlight or overstimulation, or, thank God, the pandemic for trees. Now it's very quiet. Do you think that might have been possible?
So plants are often connected underground, either communicating by the chemicals they exude from their roots, which may have positive or negative effects on things around them. Those chemicals that they're exuding are often meant to recruit beneficial microbes, whether fungi or bacteria. And for the fungi they recruit, often those fungi, they have very broad and often old underground networks of filaments that they're running through the ground. They're mycelia. Most of a fungus is underground, not the mushrooms that we see above ground. And those fungi that do live in association with trees, the mycorrhizal fungi, those networks can connect to multiple trees. They can become disconnected from trees that pass away and connect to new trees over time as they spread. And those networks are sharing water and nutrients from the soil that the fungi with their thinner filaments are better able to extract than plant roots, with the plants who are giving them carbon in return that they're fixing by photosynthesis up in their leaves and sending down. And in the literature, there is evidence that carbon can be shared across these microbial, potentially across species and within species, if they're connected by the same mycelial network. The experiments that have looked at that, sometimes it's shown, sometimes it's not shown, and so I think we still don't quite understand when these networks are fully active and built, like creating a web of connection. These networks can also be potentially hijacked. So there's an example, I think it's in walnuts, where a walnut tree may send a poison through the network to discourage its competitors.
Trees be nasty.
Yes, trees can be trolls. So there's when there's ways to interact, you can have positive and negative interactions. So, yeah.
So fascinating.
It's mostly Suzanne Simard's work that I was inspired, or I dare to approach this part of the film. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit, Ben, you said one of your favorite scenes when you watched it was the interview scene that belongs to the early 20th century portion of the triptych, that incredibly painful interview by a group of scientists that, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the character's name, Greta goes through, and about how you were really that scene stuck with you because so much of it was talking about the sexuality of plants. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your reaction to that scene, and then also hear from you, Ildikó. Oh my goodness, it's late. About why you specifically focused so much on outsiders. And I'll repeat my question for you after you talk about the scientific panel.
Sure. Yeah. I'm a plant evolutionary biologist, and so, of course, I'm like using genus and species names all the time in Linnaean binomial nomenclature, but I've never actually taken a direct full history of systematics or taxonomy sort of course, and so I hadn't appreciated that was his original scheme for plants. And that he was classifying them based on, specifically if you're thinking about flowering plants, based on the number. If you think about a flower, you've got your petals, and then interior to that, you've got the stamens, the organs with the anther sacs on the end that are making the pollen, and then you've got carpels in the center, which hold the ovules, which will be pollinated to make the seed, and kind of classifying based on the relative number of stamens, the male parts that produce the pollen, which have the sperm, and then the carpels, which have the ovules, which are the female parts that will make an egg. It really brought forward for me, because this also relates to some of my own research and also how I teach this in intro bio, kind of current thoughts about the value and challenge of using gender and sex to describe plants, in part because it's, we're imposing a binary from humans that definitely doesn't necessarily apply in many cases to plants, because we're talking about parts of a flower rather than an individual. But it's still helpful to think about how plants are achieving reproduction either through pollen, through male function, or through their ovules, through female function. And so there's a discussion about, in the literature today about whether, we should be talking about not male or female flowers or bisexual flowers, but staminate or pistillate flowers, and using more scientific terms, which becomes trickier in intro bio, where you're trying to help students learn master material. But then I think also part of the debate too is, in applying these terms and seeing the real spectrum and diversity of reproductive biology in plants, the number of plant species that have separate sexes of, individuals who just produce staminate or male flowers, or individuals who produce pistillate and female flowers, is 5 to 7% of plants. And there's a whole gamut of diversity beyond that in plants as well. And so perhaps even in leaving that gendered terminology and considering it like gender in there, it opens a view to reflect back on ourselves, like folks in the film do reflect back on themselves, about the breadth of human sexuality, as it were, and think more about diversity and why binaries are not always the best system. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ildikó, could you speak a little bit? So you wrote that scene. You wrote the scene about where she's getting absolutely. She's actually, got a spine of steel and can handle every question that's being thrown at her. But you obviously wanted to demonstrate the very deep prejudice and sexuality that was within scientific academia at the time. You also wrote this beautiful character in the 1970s that's so desperate to be seen, and then you wrote the role for Tony Leung. Can you talk a little bit about why it was so important to you to create these three disparate characters who are all kind of outside of perhaps their circles?
When you are outside of a system by being forced outside or by choice, then you seem to have two ways to react to that. One is to revolt against it. The other is to do everything to fit in. And what these heroes are doing is something, it's a third option. They just, even if they feel it, they are human, but they don't truly care. Curiosity, this sort of genuine, beautiful, childish curiosity, which is, I think, in behind every scientist, is stronger. So they just doesn't care, and that's what I did always when I met obstacles somehow, and I love them for that. Mm-hmm. So that's why I shaped their character like that.
I feel like we're gonna lose you as a filmmaker, and you're gonna go become, get your PhD in botany or something. You seem so enamored with the scientific life and the removal from perhaps the kind of daily concerns of humanity and politics and things like that.
It's not that far removed. I wish it was so removed.
True. Right now, it's very much a part of the conversation.
Actually, this strategy you can follow everywhere in filmmaking as well, which is a very, very different territory. We know. Jumping back to the scene, the examine, beside of presenting that sort of world view and the clashing. The main reason I wrote this scene was the scene afterwards when she runs out into the garden, and this is a garden. It's a very normal garden, not very exotic, not very extreme. She is seeing plants she saw already so many times, everyday plants, and she doesn't see them anymore as objects, but as sentient beings. So somehow, even if it was not a very pleasant experience, this examine, somehow it is the launching pad for her curiosity. Wow, who these beings are. And it's early summer, flowers, in everything you could see that these beings enjoy to be alive.
It's so beautiful. We're almost out of time, but I would like to ask you both to talk. You spoke a little bit earlier about how Goethe is briefly mentioned in the film, and there's the poem at the end, and I know that resonated with both of you. I knew Goethe as somebody who talked about transcendentalism and philosophy. I had no idea that they had written about scientific academic approach. What motivated you to include them in the film? And then, Ben, if you could build off of that, because I know that you had a response to it.
Each human is trying to make some experiments. Each human here is using tools, different techniques, different tools, to reach out to this other being, to the plants. And these are imperfect tools, but they are enlarging the limits of our human senses. What we used to take for granted, like the default, and we are really not the default. We are just one case among the many. This sort of approach was important for me.
But why Goethe?
I really admired him in my late teenage years for something what was not he was the most known for, his literary achievements. I was rather a Schiller person. Somehow I found it amazing. He has a very, very different approach to light. He has a theory of light, a very, very different approach to Newton. And he was very, very, very interested of botany. And for me, his approach is very up to date. And you have to tell me, somehow I had the feeling that his real appreciation came in the second part of the 20th century science. But please tell me if I'm overly enthusiastic about Goethe or...
Well, I mean,
not.
I like in my in one of
I'm
my
sorry,
classes.
not in his findings, but his
Okay.
approach.
I don't know how much I can speak to his approach. Certainly in his findings, the idea that he came to that all the various organs that come off of a stem to become a flower are modified leaves is indeed essentially how evolution proceeded, in that layers of regulatory mechanisms on top of that take a leaf and then transform it into the sepals, the petals, the stamens, and the carpels. And so it is that the leaf came first and everything is a modification of that afterward, and kind of the story of seed plant evolution is just kind of adding new and modified things in various diversity to make that happen. I think, but yeah, he was, I don't know if dabbler is the right word, but he was a savant of lots of different things.
Yes.
And I think that kind of person who's a scientist and humanist and doing, engineer, that's less common today than previously. I think the other connection to Goethe, I watched the film last weekend with some friends who are paleobotanists.
I didn't know paleobotanist was a thing. It
Yeah,
was amazing.
the study of fossil plants. And they gave me a book about ginkgos. And Goethe actually wrote a poem about ginkgos and how kind of the theme of the poem is thinking about their iconic leaves and their two parts that are highly intertwined. And it's somewhat a love poem of like thinking about being intertwined with somebody else and where they stop and you start and vice versa. And I think that speaks to a lot of the themes here with what each of the characters is doing through photography or opening a gate or the neural net and connecting with the plants in that way. So, yeah.
By the way, what is also very touching in Goethe, who was in other fields a rather arrogant guy and very self-centered guy, he had this sort of tender and calm attention for observing. And Simone Weil says that the most that you can give to another, in her case it's another human being, I think to another being, is attention, true attention. And somehow his approach misses that sort of godlike aggressivity, what was dominant in science until the turn of the century and until the First World War, I'd say.
I mean, I think also this goes to the early point in the film about spotlight versus lantern, like attention, right? And in that way, Goethe was, really trying to observe and take in everything they could, particularly if they didn't have like some specialist training and framework for coming into things. I think, as a scientist, it's the stray observations that often turn into the most exciting things. Certainly that's been true for certain paths in my own scientific life. And so, having the space and bandwidth to, be able to focus like that and, make those observations or get out in the field or like dig into an herbarium, whatever it is just so valuable.
Well, I think I find you both to be dabblers, so I like that word. I think you're both, I've spent the afternoon with you, you're both so fascinating. There's so much more to say about this film. The music is incredible, the specificity of the production design for each of the different stories. It's such an incredible journey that we go on. I know it's late and we're unfortunately out of time, but I just want to say that, Ildikó, I hope you gave us On Body and Soul, you gave us My 20th Century and so many other films, and now you've given us Silent Friend. I hope you continue to dabble and make stories. Thank you so much for being the recipient of the Sloan Science on-screen award, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Ben. Thank you all for coming out for Silent Friend, and we are all the richer for your work.
Thank you. And thank you for staying.